Hello and welcome back to the Echo Chamber podcast and our conversation with architect Mel Reynolds. In part one, we want you to remember that we discussed why an affordable home cannot be built by the private sector, why our government's housing stats aren't really reliable, why it's really a landlord's market out there, and the land casino, the hap trap, and why Fine Gael are really being financially illiterate in this area. In this next hour, Mel gives us the most optimistic outlook for the homelessness crisis, and spoiler alert, it's not that optimistic. But more importantly, we focus on solutions to the crisis, and he gives us some real and simple ideas that could start to turn the tide in months rather than years. So without further ado, here's the rest of us and the solutions architect, Mel Reynolds.
I really have to say that's kind of incredible stuff. So we're saying that the best financial solution there is out there is for the state to build what they can for around 190 grand. Then 30 years later, they can sell that on. They own the assets. So 30 years later, they can sell that on.
Whenever they want.
Recoup their 190 grand.
Or keep it, yeah.
And that they could actually keep feeding the system. And you could actually style or plan society every 30 years.
You can recycle your capital and say, it's a bit like airlines, you can own a plane for certain. Ryanair have done it, get your second-hand planes, recycle it, buy new ones at the right time. So but they control it, they could totally control the market.
So is HAP driving this dysfunctional market? Is HAP like a state-guaranteed rent? Would it be fair to call it a state-guaranteed rent?
Well, it is. I mean, a part of it comes from... Now, I mean, you could be renting a 3-bed house in Terranure for $2,000 a month and be getting a certain amount of that paid by HAP, depending on your income level. So it's a good scheme, but I suppose the thing about it is at the moment is we have the market is so tightly wound. We've so little supply in terms of new houses, continually small supply of new houses. We have very small levels of available rentals, particularly in Dublin, only 1,300. Any long-term policy, we sort of need immediate things now, and HAP it's morphine may not be good long-term, but a patient may need it. You have to keep the patient alive. So the HAP is sort of a good scheme, and you'll always, I think the Irish Council of Social Housing at the recent conference did a very interesting survey. They surveyed their existing tenants, and somewhere in the region of over 30 or 35% of tenants didn't think that owning their own house was a necessity long term.
What percentage?
Something like 35%, which is very interesting, because I would have assumed that most people who are renting or in some form of state housing would like to own their own house at some point. But the questions there were geared towards if you had security of tenure, if you had a reasonable cost to be in your property, it was reasonably well located. Was it a deal breaker not to be able to buy your house? And over a third of tenants said no, it wasn't a deal breaker. They're quite happy to stay there. Now, don't forget as well that you'll have a certain cohort of people who are, I mean, artists. The average salary of a fine artist is something like €15,000. You'll have some people who are on ultra low incomes and who are on temporary. A feature of our employment system now is we have, the precariat, so-called precariat, where you have people on very low, people in construction like myself who go through some various different grades of unpleasantness in terms of income, but you're going to have some form of state support for housing, and HAP makes an awful lot of sense as a payment, but entirely relying so heavily. I mean, the rate of increase in HAP at the moment is over 11,000 a year, and the state is building 300, maybe 400 social houses, local authority houses.
Well, this was
so you're relying really heavily on the private, and the state is not only reliant hugely on the private rental sector, it's also there's no inspection system for it. We've no security of tenure. So you're literally, if you're a state-sponsored tenant or any tenant, we've 325,000 tenancies at the moment. Almost 1 in 3 of those are state-sponsored, some form of rent assistance. And you're 42 days away, notice away from not being in the property anymore. So really, if you're going to, in one way, if they're going to go the rental system, do it properly. Have a proper inspection system for standards, have security of tenure, have rent increases that, like our current system of the rent pressure zones has sort of introduced the idea of an upward only rent review in the residential system.
Yes.
So you have, I mean, what you have now is we've got 4% a year as a given. So really, if you're going to bring in rent control, do it properly. Have it linked into CPI, into inflation. That makes sense. Why have rent control that isn't linked into inflation? It makes no sense.
IBEC came out and said real wage growth of 2.2%. So if that's what IBEC are saying as the employers group, and we're saying that rent is going to go up by 4%,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, you're worse off.
Yeah, and you look at the draft report. I think the best if you were an investor looking at the Q3 draft report or Q4 draft report, you would have Q3. You would have seen that. I think Longford had the best yields. They were around 12%. You could buy 2-bed in Longford Town for about 45,000 at the time. Second best was Ballymun 1-beds, and they were over 11%. So when you add over 3 years, when you add on 4%, you're looking at a yield there of over 12%, which is absolutely massive.
Phenomenal. Yeah.
So in a normal market, the interesting thing I think John McCartney or other commentators pointed out, at the time when the rent pressure zones were introduced, rents had started to level off and even drop in some areas. So the market had already started to calm down a little bit, and the rent pressure zone came in, and all of a sudden we're off again.
We had a target.
We had a target. So I don't know, but it's certainly, as a measure, it would need to be analysed by people who know what they're at. The yields are very... the thing that surprised me is we have a market now where increases are in double digits and rent increases are in double digits, which I thought that there would be some sort of yield compression where prices would continue to go up and rents would level off. That appears not to be the case, and rents are continuing to accelerate. So that's a real pressure point for us in terms of competitiveness. You know, all the reasons that people have read about, something like 25% of tech recruitment agency, people who are contacted by tech recruitment agencies are saying, no, we don't want to go to Dublin because it's too expensive.
It has to be a glaring
So
reason. And some of the things we tendered for, the European banking license, we tendered for the medical one, and all of these things, the cost of housing is a huge detriment. But when you come back to happen, you come back to something like the current arrears crisis that's washing through the courts, really at the steps of the courts in the thousands, the numbers that are in the thousands. So you're talking about HAP at 825. Imagine a multiple of that if another 10,000 come on stream in terms of
the arrears thing is a real problem. I think that the Peter McVerry Trust said that it was something like the number one headline issue for homelessness prevention. What we have is something like 47,000 properties in arrears of 2 years or more.
Yeah.
I suppose I was asked to participate on one Right to Homes bill by Edward Honeywell. It's a very interesting initiative to try and address this and to try and keep people in their homes. And I had sat through Seamus Coffey's presentation. Carl Dieter had done some really good work on this. I think Brendan Burgess as well was involved in demonstrating that the number of repossessions that were happening was a fraction of what the alarmists were talking about.
Brendan was a big one for saying the tsunami's not.
He was right, and the data was there. But the interesting thing about this is what caught my eye was the buy-to-lets in arrears. It's something like 14,000 buy-to-lets in arrears of 2 years or more.
Yeah.
Now I had looked at this and thought, okay, most people wouldn't really care if you're an investor. If you bought at the wrong time, tough. It's a casino. You live by the sword, you die by the sword, and I'd go along with that. That's the way it is. But the interesting thing is if 10 for every 10 properties that come on the market, 5 are bought by owner occupiers at the moment, and 5 are bought by investors. So that's just a feature. It's 50-50. If you've 10 existing tenanted properties, half of them are going to be displaced. Half of those existing tenants are going to be displaced. Well, first thing is...
Take vacant occupancy.
Yeah, so first thing is all 10 are going to be vacated because solicitors and agents you say you'll get more money if it's vacant. So you've got what's known as frictional vacancy. Those 10 units are vacant for 3 or 4 months, however long it takes to sell. When they're sold, half will be occupied by new owner occupiers. Now, if those new owner occupiers are renters, it's fine, you have no displacement. But if you have people who are either living with their mom and dad or coming from abroad or not in the existing rental system, you have displacement. And any sort of simplified scenario of this, I had to look at a few of these So, and this would assume that, say, you've got consensual sales, no repossessions.
Yeah.
In any way, the buy-to-lets don't come under, you know, if you have an issue, receivers appointed, so it doesn't come.
They're not.
No, the axe falls very quick.
Yeah, it's not really code of conduct mortgage arrears type of territory.
No, it's not. So I mean, the most optimistic scenario with the arrears now, if you multiply that out by 47,000 over a 3-year workout period, when you have no displacement by new owner occupiers coming into the market and it's a 50-50 break, you get a doubling of homelessness in over 3 years. You get 1,500 additional families, households are made homeless, which is a big number. When you have, if you change turn some of the dials on this and see what numbers fall out. Now, the reason for that is we've got 1,300 available rentals in the country. So if you have the frictional displacement of 1,500 houses a year, straight away means that all of those are essentially vacated, and you're looking at people looking for a house and there's no available houses there. A lot of people who are in arrears, if they own their own house, will have equity in them, so they're fine. They'll have money to keep them going. Credit rating might be shot, but they'll have money. But it's other people at the moment who are hanging on, who are at the lower incomes, will be pushed. It's like books on the end of a shelf. But when you go to, one agent was telling me that the proportion of new owner occupiers not renting is around 40%. If you put that in, and if you change, say if you were to bring in a pro owner occupier incentive, and the mix goes from 60% owner occupier to 40% investor active in the market, you're talking about serious number of arrears, and the cost in the most optimistic scenario, where you have 1,500 new homeless families, is about 800 million over 3 years. The cost to the state, where you end up trying to put people in hubs and emergency accommodation, where you have this sort of 60-40 displacement, is 2.6 billion. So it's absolute, and you have somewhere in the region of about 7,000 or 8,000 homeless families, which won't happen because the homeless system can't take that. But there's a number of sort of unknown components to it that I haven't been in. Like, for example, what's the breakup of new owner occupiers? How many aren't existing renters? No one knows, and that's a critical component. Should be a critical component into policy here, and they don't know it. So, you know, the arrears thing is a real problem, and I think in terms of housing policy and solutions, I think all you have to do is look at the Oireachtas All-Party Committee report done in July 2017, which was a really good document.
You're very complimentary of that.
That's good. It's a bit long, but, you know, I keep on I come back to it. It's really good. And one of the key components there is they said they want to stay on all repossessions until the government comes up with a proper strategy to deal with it. I mean, if we only have 1,300 available rentals, and if we're allowing 47,000 properties, that you don't get any new or lose properties, but if you're allowing the ownership profile to change in an unstructured fashion, where we only have 1,300 available rentals, you're really pushing the elephant through the keyhole on it, and there's going to be some fallout on that. So the question is, how long is it going to happen? Over what period? If you extend the period, it's actually slightly worse in some scenarios. But it would appear that there's been very little forward planning of this, and I think the assumption is that every new owner occupier is a renter, and the second assumption is that we're not creating or losing houses, so we'll be grand.
Yeah.
We're nowhere near grand on this, and this is a real big problem coming down the tracks.
So, essentially, homelessness is, you can't see a way that homelessness is going to contract at the way the system is set up at the moment. It's not going to contract. There's going to be no contraction, and yet the government is planning, or is building places like family hubs. It's also planning these, for want of a better word, bedsit towers, be they student, be they professional, be they whatever they want them to be. But that in itself is increasing pressure on rent per square foot right across Ireland. They're getting more money for denser concentrations of people all the time, and that's working against your property market as well.
Yeah, well, there's a few sort of counterintuitive or sort of negative feedback loops at the moment. I mean, the most valuable, if you're to look at a site in town, a simple way of looking at this is that the most valuable use at the moment is probably student housing. That's the best return you'll get.
That's why they're popping up.
That's why a lot of people are going for that as a use, because it enhances your site value. And sort of an executive hub is really the same thing, except with a better fit out from what I can see. It's the same plan. I know one or two people are looking into this stuff as well. So, you know, for the equivalent space of a 2-bed apartment, if it's, you know, you might rent that for 1,800. The average rent, I think, in town is about 1,800.
I think it's higher now.
Is it
but
higher now, is
yeah.
it? The same space, if it was used for an executive hub, could be 4,000 or 5,000 euros. It'd be twice that. If it's student housing, it's 3,000 euros. So it's a lot cheaper to build. You've no amenities, you've no balcony space, you've no Part 5 social and affordable housing, you've no creches, you've none of that, and you've no car parking. So you can build these things pretty cheaply. You know, your value, if you look at Isaac's hostel in town was sold recently, and the value per room there, I think they were fitting maybe 5 per room, is about 210,000 euros a room. So your sales value of these, so the interesting thing is that the hotel short stay accommodation, which is very small rooms, or you know, this sort of hub accommodation,
Co-living is the new
or
thing.
whatever you want to call it. Like, that's probably the most valuable sort of schemes you can get at the moment. And it's really interesting that the state, as an emergency measure, is using the most expensive form of accommodation to house people who are homeless, which you can say is, listen, that's a really good, it's a necessary thing to do in terms of social and humanitarian thing. But on the cost side of it, on the one hand, you've got the cost of your HAP, which is 8,250 a year. The average cost for a household in emergency accommodation is 69,000 euros a year.
And the hotel, we're paying 20 million per week to hoteliers for emergency accommodation and housing people.
Well, and then some people say, well, do you know what? Whatever it takes, just pay it. But
Oh yeah, no, I understand
at
that,
the
but my
same-
point is just that if we're going to talk about a fiscally responsible thing and actually having a roadmap out of it, it's no good keeping all your fingers in the dike unless the guy behind you is actually building something.
Yeah,
that's
well, you see, they don't actually need to build it, and this is where you're back to the sort of pounds, shillings, and pence thing. We know that NOAC, Government Watchdog, did a survey of local authorities in 2015, and Dublin City Council, as an example, of something like 993 units that have been vacant for 10 years or more. They're pending regeneration. Now, talk to anybody, you know, you can refurbish an existing unit. If it's no windows in it, it'll cost you maybe 50 or 60,000 euros to, possibly less, I'd say, to refurbish it. If the structure is there, the roof is intact, that's half your build cost. So for less than the annual cost of one family in emergency accommodation, Dublin City Council could refurbish an existing unit that they own. Now, all you have to do is walk around Sean McDermott Street, Foley Street, walk anywhere in town, and you'll see these blocks that a lot of them may have one or two tenants. They've been de-tenanting them over years. They could be refurbished at a fraction of the cost. You could probably refurbish 8 of these units for the cost of one 3-bed semi-D out in outer Dublin.
So you I mean, it's an 8-to-1. It's a ratio.
8 to 1. So,
Yeah.
like for maybe 50 million euros, and it could be done within 4 to 6 months. Dublin City Council could take about 900 families out of emergency
Well,
accommodation.
that knocks one thing, because I was going to ask you for 3 solutions.
Oh, that's one sort of,
three
that's one
immediate
straight away.
solutions.
I think
yeah.
Dublin Inquirer have actually written some really good articles
They
about
have.
that, and a few other people have done it as well. So, you know, there's nothing. I think one of the barriers to that is the department don't have a sort of normal refurb. I mean, a friend of mine bought a house last year, a corporate house. His budget was 30 grand. He, you know, the windows are still single glazed. It's a lovely house now. You walk into it, he said, I'll do that and wait for the fuel tanks to fill up and do it again. You know, you need to have a bit of practicality about it. And the thing about the refurbs is, if you have a block of 20 units that are vacant and you've 2 tenants in them, you can refurbish all of those individually. Just any builder can go in and do it. And it's really easy work. New kitchen, new bathroom, externally insulated. Away you go. You don't even have to tender it. You can
Well,
re-raise.
you could actually have permanent staff. That is one place where you could have permanent staff, and the more they do it, the better they get at it.
I think it's between 2 and 3 years for people in emergency accommodation at the moment, which is a horrific process. But if you were to say, we're going to demolish this in 5 years, it still makes financial sense to do it up for 40, 50 grand. You have
Yes.
your money back within 9 months, and you've got 2 or 3 years for free, even as a temporary measure. If it isn't the ultimate place where they're going to go. We know that we've 183,000 vacant homes around the country, which is twice the international norm. We also know that the CSO, their methodology, doesn't capture vacant upper floors over shops.
Shops, yes, that's right.
So, and we know that Dublin City Council has done their own desktop study, and Minister Murphy has quoted it, where we've enough space above shops without building one additional room for 4,000 apartments in Dublin. So we have this vast amount of existing space that could be refurbished at 30, 40 grand. One of the barriers to existing vacant space reuse is our statutory system, which is very costly and very complex. The cost in the UK to do a change of use for a vacant upper floor is around 670 or 700 pounds, and it takes 10 days.
That's good turn. That's not
you
bad.
go in and you go in. They have their own inspectors. You tell them when you're going to start. You depending on your build or how big it is, you'll have 2 or 3 key inspection dates. So you send them a 2-day notice in advance. They come out to you. At the end of it, they say, "Yeah, it all looks grand. There you go. We're not giving you a guarantee, but we're saying it looks fine to us." And you have a proper inspection. Here, what you have is you've got to similar planning system, which planning isn't really a problem. Planning is fine. It'll take 2 to 3 months, and you can do this in parallel. But here, once you get planning, you have to apply for fire cert, which is a separate, it's like a mini planning application. You also have to go for disabled access cert, which is a separate process, which can be done in parallel. If you don't get any of those two, you can't proceed. So it doesn't matter whether you get planning or not. And then you have to start complex procedures that were brought in 2014, BCAR SR9, which are building control procedures, where you very document heavy. It's all to do with it was called reinforced self-certification, but it's extremely costly. So for those 3 components, which are the sort of building control, if we lump them all together, where you're doing a separate application for fire, separate to planning, you're doing a separate application for disabled access, and you have this really elaborate self-certification system. The cost for those 3 is around €7,600 for a really simple change of use. So, and the time needed is 100 days. So, like if you were coming into me, and if you had an office in it and you wanted to change it into a co-housing student apartment, or 2 of them, then I'd say to you, don't bother, because it'll be too expensive, it'll take too long, and chances are you won't get it. So just leave it the way it is.
You know, you look at something simple as the refurbishing, as you said, refurbishing the units that they're actually already in the remit of the county councils. We've talked about the stock that's actually it's an overhang of stock, if I want to use it, that's sitting there that can be brought into use for about 30,000-40,000. The other thing that troubles me is the HAP side of things, where we're talking about, you know, this could snowball into it's causing rents to go up, but it's not, if it's not the contributing factor, it's one of the contributing factors to why rents are going up, because you can get more if you know someone can pay more. The market is not dysfunctional, as Lorcan told us. The market's doing exactly what it's supposed to do. It's just it's
once you know what the factors are, it's operating in a particular way.
So my other, you know, the other thing is, obviously, in terms of the cost, you've demonstrated how you could buy a place for 100 and build and buy for 190,000, rent it out, and make sure that actually washes its own face, saves the state money based on what we'd be paying currently on HAP, and we own the underlying asset. That's also an option for some of the arrears problems as well.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
And that's something that, you know, the state needs to wake up to, that there is actually this nonsense of moral hazard has to go away when it makes financial sense.
Yeah, I mean, the sorry to cut across you there. I mean, the moral hazard is sort of interesting. We had a little bit of this recently with officials, you know, was talking about gaming the system, and I think previous to that there was issues about homeless people have brought the situation on themselves.
That's right, yes.
I mean, the first thing is, if we had the rate of fatalities in our prisons that we've had in the homeless sector, we'd have Amnesty International on top of us like a ton of bricks. You know,
Great point.
You know, it just wouldn't be acceptable. Now, if you start, I suppose the interesting thing about the whole housing first concept is, when I was reading, you know, I think Finland is the only country in Europe to not have any homeless problem, and they'd be the first place you go and look, how have they done it, right? And the whole reading about the guy who started off, he was saying that is housing first. Now, this is a phrase that's bandied around by our government here, but what we've seen really is an unconscious bias towards, you know, certain segments of society, or, you know, gaming the system. You know, people brought it on themselves or whatever. Now, in terms of gaming the system, I would be very surprised if every system is gamed. Right?
Yeah,
if you look at the local property tax, there's a lot of discussion this week. I don't know if you recall, back in 2013, the OPW found out that had declared the value of RS and Nuclear at 750,000 for the purpose of property tax. And that was to get.
That's very good.
Yeah, 750,000. That was to get it down. I think the examiner broke it. That was to get it down below the million threshold, where you'd be paying slightly higher.
Yeah.
So there's an example of where you have a system. The state is sort of charging itself, so there's nothing to be gained. But some bright spark said, let's gain the system on it.
Yeah.
So we have to sort of get past ourselves and get past our own little, on one hand, you have strategic defaulters, you have for mortgage arrears, if, Tony, if you've been sitting on an investment property, you haven't paid anything back in 4 years and you're waiting for a big payout, I'll fight tooth and nail over that. And yet somebody else who might have had 200 million of a loan wiped off in NAMA doesn't get the same. We don't seem to have the same problem with the big numbers that we do with the people beside us.
Clearly not.
So I think what we need to do is get past all that stuff and say, okay, what's the solution? Assume you're going to have a certain percentage of people, be it, strategic defaulters, people gaming the system or whatever.
Every system will have
it. You can't have a rock and just get on with it and do it. And the single biggest problem that they had in Finland in implementing the reforms was getting people's attitudes to same. The whole idea about everyone deserves a house. That simple phrase, get everyone to buy into it. And he said it was incredibly difficult to get that. And that's one phrase, and you say everyone deserves a house.
Our Taoiseach said it just before Christmas, and I know we're not going to get into identity politics, but he did say you don't get a house for nothing, and I thought that's the wrong phrase.
But I think
a home where someone can actually, because if everybody games the system, it's a percentage of people who game the system. It's a minuscule percentage of people who game the system. But if you have a home over your, you will be a net contributor into the.
Well, you see, it doesn't matter if you look at the numbers, it probably would be much cheaper if you were to ring fence 1,000 homeless families and give them a house now. It's the same price for 3 years emergency accommodation. It's actually been given a house for free. So, are we going to... The other interesting thing, I think, in Focus Ireland have some really good infographics on homeless. I'm no expert on this at all, and I profess no expertise in it. But there's one very interesting one about the increase in homelessness, and it's linear. Now, you never get any linear... In a system as dynamic as this, you don't get a linear growth, a straight line growth. And what you're seeing is straight line growth in homelessness. And it's quite clear, a little bit like the trolleys, is that there's a certain amount of... assume that we'll have a certain level of homelessness that you'll have a little bit of... You're going to get it in the neck if you're a politician for it. But if you make it so that you declare homeless and 2 weeks later you're in a local authority house, this perception is there that everyone is going to be declaring homeless, right? So, which is probably correct. I'd do it myself if that was the case.
Yeah.
So you make the system a bit like A&E, as most difficult as possible. So if you enter into it, it'll take you 2 or 3 years, and it's very unpleasant. So you stop it at source. It's a bit like if you cleared all the trolleys away from the hospitals in the morning, you're creating capacity, they'll be filled up again. And that's because of certain dysfunction. So really, in order to get past that, we have to start building and bringing on the supply. Existing building supply is critical to this. In a lot of parts of Ireland, it's not feasible to build still. It's too expensive to build. So buy and get all the vacant units out of it. But the first thing is we have to get over our own... all of us get over our own unconscious biases and say, everyone deserves a house. Let's get to it. How do we do it? It's far cheaper to do it. Why, if we're worried about the guy who's gaming the system and he's costing 69,000, well, do you know what? I'm not going to let him game the system. I'm going to keep paying 69,000 for 2 years.
Yeah.
As opposed to saying, well, get over yourself and get, HAP is 8,200. Probably you finance a house for 6.5. Do you know what? Game away.
There's a brilliant economic
6,500.
study on how much is spite costs. So spite.
Oh yeah, it's a spike. It's actually a spite cost.
Yeah,
that's it.
That's it. So because you see, spite isn't real, and economists will tell you spite's not real. Yet there's a spite cost, and so for out of spite, we're going to cost ourselves this money just to say, I'm not going to let him game the system. And that's the kind of lunacy where, especially when we want to work in it, we're obsessed with debt to GDP ratio in this country. We need to fix the debt to GDP. We have to get to 3%. We need to be the best boys in class. If you want to do that, this makes sense.
Well, I have to say, I haven't heard that phrase before, and you two guys have really nailed it.
It's a great one.
What's going on at the moment? When we know there are solutions that make better fiscal sense, better long-term sense, better social sense, create a calm in society that's beginning to upset society, and it is coming. You more and more people you leave homeless, the more and more risk you have in your society of a very unhappy society. And you two guys have said they're doing it just for spite. It doesn't actually make sense to do this. None of it does.
Well, I think there's Malcolm Gladwell did a very interesting short story about this. I think it was about homelessness and the hospital system in the States, and he worked. There was one particular guy who was in and out of hospital, and he worked out that it would have been cheaper after 1 year to give this guy a free apartment than to have him out in the street, because every time he was out, he didn't get time to convalesce and he was back in the hospital. But it can't happen because you'd have, and rightly so, people who are working hard, travelling in their cars. We have 200,000 people in a car for more than an hour every morning. So they'd be and they say, hold on a minute, this guy's done nothing, welfare bum, etc., and he's getting a free unit. That's a situation where you have something that makes perfect economic sense, but it isn't going to happen. The difficulty we have is if we have concepts of ideology or opinion-based policy, we're getting significant adverse outcomes. The ones I can spot would be, if we bring in some anti-investor measures now at the moment, you're going to have a spike in homeless. Some of these are counterintuitive. If we continue with pro-owner-occupier incentives for housing, what happens is it's back to the arrears thing. You're going to have, and if that's happening at the same time. So there's a number of different connections here in it. In terms of the solutions, I think we need to get over ourselves on it and to kind of just look at practically how can you do this stuff. And one of the, we need technical input on that, and we need people who know how to do stuff quickly. One of the biggest problems that we haven't mentioned is barriers to social housing, and probably one of the biggest barriers at the moment is the Department of Housing's 4-stage approval process. So they have a funding approval process, right? And they have, if you want to fund a project, there's 4 stages. It's sort of micromanaged, so you have to go in at each stage. Now, in the normal course of events, if you're doing a job, I saw there's an infographic available online, and the minute I was going to have a T-shirt made of it and give it to friends for Christmas, because the minute I saw it, as somebody who's involved in this, and I've been on the development side and on the procurement side as well, straight away you'd immediately lose the will to live and say, oh, nothing's going to be built immediately, because it probably takes about 3 or 4 days to decide if you're going to do a project or not. You drill into it a bit more. Yeah, you set out your stall and you say, okay, if you were a local authority, you'd say, here's the money, go off and do it. You guys manage it and keep an eye on costs. We know already that a 2-bed costs about 191,000, probably about 200 now, plus or minus 10%. That's your target. There's 100 million, go off and do it. If you're over that, come back to us and look at it. That's the way. It should be one stage. That's it. This thing about micromanaging it, where over and back, I think in a number of cases that projects I have seen, it's taken over 3 years. So I mean, there's the one recent project, I think the IV Trust did it, I sat in on a lecture on it, it was 70 units sheltered housing, was mentioned in the media as well. It took 7 years.
My God.
7
what you
years.
have, and I know from talking to people in local authorities who are very keen to get moving, is they cannot get the funding because it's either designed, it's a combination of somebody who doesn't know what they're at, somebody who's deliberately trying to stop projects happening, or a mixture of the two, one or the other. Because there's no, really what local authorities need is cheap land and the money to build or to refurbish and get on with it. On the local authority side, I've know anecdotally that there's a reluctance to employ technical staff. So they're just worried that when things settle down in 2 or 3 years, they'll have architects and engineers and QSs that'll be spinning their wheels and nothing to do. What they don't realise is we probably need to be building about 10,000 social houses a year for 10 years.
They don't understand that also housing stock depletes on the basis that houses actually have a life cycle as well.
6,000 a year we're losing into derelictions. There's a natural rate of dereliction.
And they never factor this in. It drives me insane.
Well, the interesting thing is if you compare yourself, I suppose another question, how many do we need, right? If you're looking at solutions, we know what the demand is. We're at risk of being into perpetual diagnosis here where we're looking at all the things going wrong. How do we solve it? So what's our demand here? We need about 10,000 a year. We know that from the rent supplement.
Yeah.
We also need, talking from a number of people who are well informed, they reckon that maybe, I think we've got 120,000 people on housing waiting lists at the moment.
Yes, yeah, we do. Yeah.
So on the combined lists, and there's a little bit of sleight of hand there because if you're on the HAP, you're on a transfer list, but you're not on the headline list. There's about 29,000 people on HAP that added to the 96.
Yeah, it's
gives
100,000 on the housing waiting
Yeah.
list. So added, it's over
It's
125,000.
over 100, and that's going up by 11,000 a year. So we know the demand is there, the money is there. We've 8,200 a year. We know that can fund a bill if needs be. How do we do it? That's the question. And we know that from the affordable side, we've got the O'Coulon model.
Yeah.
They've, we said
They've
local
proven
authorities can build all in for 190. O'Coulon can do it for 150. So it's a different form of procurement. We know co-ops in Germany are 30% of all housing are co-ops.
Yes.
Here, O'Coulon are doing it. That's it. New Grand tried to do it for social housing out in Mulhudders as well. So really what the state should be doing is saying, do you know what? This is a hospital with no trolleys. How did they do it? Let's copy it at scale and bring the guys out and say, okay, we want you to train up 14 people a week in how to set up a co-op, and away you go, and get all the guards and nurses, people who have access to pension funds, change the rules to it. There's loads of capital out here for
There
it.
is huge.
And if O'Coulon can get it from the banks and totally privately funded, anyone can get it. So that's one area. In terms of your statutory permissions for your existing vacant buildings, 3 statutory instruments that could be written by Minister Murphy in the morning would simplify our current system for permissions that I mentioned earlier, which takes 100 days.
And
Down to the UK
7,000 €7,000 opposed to £600.
It's even more, because if you rolled in your planning levies, we're not doing this sort of work at the moment, and it's €8,000 of a cheque that you hand over to your local authority when you get your permission. But if you were to say, okay, let's charge them 500, you will save people €14,000 per unit for a refurb of an existing commercial unit. So now the people who have confirmed a streamlined one-stop shop system is actually in the Fianna Fáil vacant housing bill at the moment, which is great. But the only reason it's a bill is because they're an opposition party. If they were Fine Gael, or if this was a minister, he could sit down. All he'd have to do is talk to Orla Hegarty, who's assistant professor in UCD, and Ono Cuffick, who's the my ex-teacher in building control. Just get them in a room for probably an hour, and they would actually write it out for you and tell you exactly the subsections to do it. So it's 3 statutory instruments, need no primary legislation, can do it. And also the inspections that are done by the local authority would be proper inspections, unlike self-certification, which we still have. They can operate as well as an inspection system for the existing private rental sector. So you can kill off 2 birds with one stone and get a panel together and do it, and it'll cost you €250 for someone to come out and say, yep, that's fine, it's habitable for the rental sector. So you have a really simple way, can be done in the morning, free up an awful lot of space. Let the market do it. If somebody realises they can, if you wanted to turbocharge it, bring in a tax relief to have an Airbnb upstairs over your shop. And we know that there's a pent-up demand. Decant all the Airbnbs out of the existing permanent rental accommodation, put them over shops where you don't have balconies and car parking spaces, and happy days, and say you can earn €10,000-20,000 tax-free. See how it goes. If it doesn't go well, great.
If it goes too well, you can rein it in a little bit.
You have a demand from Airbnb that's bringing tourists in. Why fight it? Use it to occupy vacant upper floors and reduce the costs. Bring in the taxpayer. Nobody's doing this anyway. Won't cost a penny. We know from doing scenarios on this that will actually alleviate the workload on local authorities once they get familiar with it. So a streamlined one-stop shop system, combined with, that has a sort of an NCT built into it because of the local authority inspection panel. That's your Fianna Fáil vacant housing bill, and it makes huge sense. Now, I am Orla Hegarty, and who's an expert on this. I'd say about 2 hours you'd have it written with Ona Cuffick would do it. So that's for your existing vacant houses. Your local authority stock, there's a load of it there. We also know that the local authorities own enough land to build something like 40,000 units. That's what we know of. We know the sites that we have looked at they've understated the amount, so it's quite possible that they own enough land to build 60,000-70,000 units.
There was a few times where they discovered that after getting Irish Water involved that they reservoirs they didn't know they had in their remit as well. So
Well, I do know that there was one. I think Louise Byrne in RTE did a very interesting programme on new ground out in Mulhudders, and there was a site there that they tried to get off the ground as a co-op, and ironically it fell aground because the title of the houses was going to go back to the state after 20 years. So that's how perverse the whole thing about on balance sheet funding is. But that site was 3 times the size of the size that was noted on Rebuilding Ireland vacant site. So it's quite possible that the amount of land that's owned by local authorities that's zoned residential can take quite a significant amount.
So there's
more.
enough to take a punch out of what's there at the moment
Huge
in the
amount here.
crisis.
So they can manage the land they have. In terms of land value, a lot of local authorities say, well, we've loans associated with this, etc. A local authority can buy a field, or they could buy 8. Cherrywood is 820 acres. You could buy 4 farms down in Wicklow.
Oh yeah, and just
At 10 grand an acre, rezone
yeah.
it, and enter into license agreements, put in the infrastructure yourself at about €1,500 per unit, de-risk it by getting the planning yourself and sell it on, or enter into license agreements with builders the same way that Hines are doing out in Cherrywood, to build at set prices. So you could actually manage the land in that way. So local authorities can create value and manage. That's what they do in Singapore.
Yes.
They totally create, and they determine what the sales prices are at the end of it. And they do a little bit of that in Zurich
Well,
as well.
I have to say now, if I was, and there will be the very, very odd Fine Gael listener listening to this, and I'd be sitting at home and I'd be going, you mean it's cheaper to do it the right way than it is to do it the way we're doing it now at the moment? And I'd be saying, why aren't we doing it? The problems it's causing in our society, the amount of governance time that has gone into fiddle-farting around with housing is detracting from other areas that probably need better focus on.
Oh yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's relatively easy to do this and to sort it out. I mean, the other interesting thing, the most expensive component, and we've talked about sort of the land issue, is land. I mean, that's, if you want to build if you wanted to put a container, or say if you wanted to buy a mobile home, right, €40,000, and put people in mobile, if you said that's what we're going to do for the crisis, you'd be selling those for 180,000 in Dún Laoghaire at the moment, because the land price, the VAT. So what the critical component that makes all this work is cheap land, and we actually have a mechanism for obtaining cheap land from the market at the moment. It's called Part 5. Now, if you build a scheme of 10 units or more, you have to put in a Part 5 proposal, and there's various different ways of meeting your for social housing.
Yes.
The primary one is where you provide discounted prices to your local authority to purchase the unit. We mentioned them earlier, they're quite expensive. But land in that equation is calculated, it's what's known as an existing use value, which is a formula which can't be gamed, you can't game it. But it's basically sort of a 30-year cost. And for example, the Part 5 proposals that we put in, that I've seen in Cherrywood, I'm just making it, it's just getting the focus.
Yeah.
There's no agenda here, but it's just I know what the numbers are. But the land cost in the €343,000 proposed Part 5 unit price that Neville's are suggesting in Cherrywood, there's 32 units there, is €1,000. But that's one of the options available to a local authority, is they can just buy the land, 10% of the land, off developers. So in that instance, the local authority could turn around and say, okay, give me 10% of the site close to the entrance where you can put in a short drainage run for €32,000, which is pretty good. Price of a nice car,
excellent money, yeah.
right? They could then turn around to somebody like O'Coulon Housing and say, we're going to enter a license agreement with you, we're going to sell the sites on to Tony and to Mel and Martin for €1,000, which is the same price that they did in Ballymun, and you guys are going to build out and you have a 5% profit margin. So they build it out, they'll cost them 160,000, and say keep 2 for yourself for admin costs. So straight away you have a situation where you could provide 10% housing there, affordable housing if you want it, under the Part 5 model for 180,000. Now, there's no reason why the local authority couldn't do that themselves for the social housing as opposed to paying 350.
Yes.
And we know, current industry estimates for sales prices in those locations are around about 350 or 360,000. But I've sat on the other side of the table, and that's what you do. It's like a negotiation. You say, give me A. The local authority come back and say, no, we'll give you half that, and you end up somewhere in between.
Yeah.
So the average price that local authorities are paying now is about 270 for it. They should be paying. It should be costing the state no more than 190 or 200,000 for a 2-bed.
When you say you can build it out for 190, It's really been eye opening. And I know Martin is sitting there on the edge of his seat. Actually, can't actually wrap his head around the idea that there are solutions. They're actually affordable solutions, and actually things that save money. It's one of the things that we need to. It's how we're going to take the fight to people when you actually say, this is not just something that we want to do for the betterment of society, which we do, but it's also something we want to do because it pays for itself. It's a more sustainable model. I don't know, Martin. Have you? How are you finding this?
Well, I get disappointed then, because I think that there's people like Mel, and there's Lorcan, and there's Rory, and there's Anthony, and there's Erica. There's all these people that we've brought in here, and they all say that this is a fixable problem. And what you've told us today is not only is it fixable, it actually makes more sense economically to fix this, and to fix it now. And there are pathways to fixing it. And we've spoken about pathways in housing before. And at the moment, there's no pathways for people who find themselves in a family hub or find themselves homeless. There is no prescribed route to get yourself out of it. But you've described routes, not only to bring the homeless people out of it, but people who are marginal, who are on the edge, who should be able to afford homes in the past, who would have been, and now are contributing to the homelessness crisis and the housing emergency that exists at the moment. And I suppose, Tony, I just get frustrated with all of this. I get frustrated that the knowledge, the know-how exists. All we're lacking is the will. And as you said, what was it about facts? The
Stylized
facts.
facts.
Yeah,
stylized facts. And what have we got to ditch? All we've got to ditch is the stylized facts and work off some real hard data, and we can solve the problems.
Yeah, I mean, there's one retired engineer I know, and he's a production engineer, and he specialised in going in and turning around companies that were sort of going a bit west. And he said, the first thing you do is you say, what are we measuring? How are we measuring it? What do we want to do? How do we get there? So you cannot manage what you cannot measure. So the number one thing is you have to get away from the fog and the deliberate, using valid but not reliable indicators. How much are we doing? First of all, it's basic things. How many homes are we building? Probably about 9,000 this year. 7,500 will be built for sale or rent, where 1,500 would be self-built units for people to live in themselves. Our natural level of obsolescence, you mentioned, it was about 6,000 a year. So we're still treading water on that. So it's going to take, our rate of increase is about 2,000 a year. We're 2,000 up on last year. So it's going to take, very simply, you say, how long will it take us to get up to 18,000? Maybe about 6 years, safely. If we do it any faster, we'll be building the same stuff we did in 04, which is dreadful stuff. So what do we do to keep the patient alive? Existing buildings. And now Rebuilding Ireland is over 18 months old now. Pillar 5 had to do with the reuse of existing buildings. There's still no meaningful detailed proposals under that. That really should have been Pillar 1, to say what's the immediate thing we do, both for local authority owned units and for the private sector. How do we make it simpler? And there are some very simple fixes there that are technical, but we know the technical people to phone. There are technical people out there who know this stuff, and then we can drill into it. Then you look at the build sector. We've a capacity issue here. For every 10,000 new homes, you need 20,000 staff to build them. So if we're going to ramp up by 10,000, where are they going to live? We only have 1,300 available rentals. There's sort of a square peg in the round hole here. So we need to be mindful of that as well and say, right, why are we building all these offices? Why is NAM involved in building all these offices? The EXO building was out here at the moment, and it's great, and hotels, etc. So you're into this sort of cycle of misfires in terms of using our resources. Why build one 3-bed semi-D out in County Dublin when you can refurbish 80 units in town, which are better located, to have all the infrastructure, are in well-established communities
and more desirable.
We know the regen process in PPPs. For every one that's done, we lose 60% existing. The 30-70, we're losing units. Charlemagne Street, we got back I think 75 new units, but the original total in that scheme 20 years ago was 210. So the PPP model doesn't work. We have a net loss of units there. So what do we do for 2020, we're going to miss our targets. We could use our buildings, the sort of stuff that we're talking about building here for local authorities. Think about all the corporation houses we have. I can't see any from here, but you go to any location in Ireland and you see the same sort of house. You have a cookie cutter design too, and they're great, and they can be done up. We know that Simon McGuinness and DIT did an exercise called Cabra House last year to show that for 60,000 you can bring this up to NRPIT standard, which is superior to A1 standard. So they're very resilient. So just get a cookie cutter design, go down to Moss Art to get the passive house design, roll these out all over the country, use that as a mechanism to upskill the construction sector to true low energy building, because we have a skills deficit along with a staff deficit. You can kill two birds with the one stone there. In terms of the cheap land, is we have the mechanism to manage our land at the moment, which is Part 5. No primary legislation is needed. One ministerial guideline to make the purchase of land the preferred option. We can then take it in charge and employ contractors under license to build it. You can also, if it were 20%, we could have affordable housing for a similar price and at lower than that magic maximum threshold of 240,000.
Yes.
So we wouldn't be paying through the nose for privately funded social housing, which we know is very expensive. It's 480,000 up in Marianella. Dublin City Council paid for it. So Part 5 isn't really working at the moment the way it should. An awful lot of schemes are being built out with no social housing at all in it. And we have, the way to do it is, when we're having serious site value inflation at the moment, if you're to increase Part 5 from 10 to 20%, and if half of that is affordable housing for co-ops like O'Coulon, etc., that cost would be inflated out of a land price in about 9 months at the moment. So now is the time to do it, because commercially it'll have a little bit of it's a bit like increasing stamp duty, a little bit of an effect.
But it's not going to,
Now, the industry would hate it, obviously.
Yeah.
And if I owned a site like that, I wouldn't be as strong to advocate it. But you have it, and you can do it. So, we have a certain number of builders, we have a certain amount of trades. We need to focus them in the right areas. If you could turn around to the 120 people on the housing list and say, actually, do you know what, we have a plan in place, and we're going to, in 5 years' time, you're going to be able to buy a house for 220,000 in County Dublin. Like, that is the JFK rocket to the moon at the moment. So if somebody can come out and say, this is the way we can do it, and this is what we're going to do, and this is even before you get into social engineering. I think there's this mantra that we were talking about earlier on, where we have to get used to renting. We need small units. We can't have a car. We have to, we have to live in really small units, very high up, and have no living room in it. Why? We should all be able to aspire to home ownership, and there should be an idea there that if somebody wants to, they can live in subsidised accommodation, or if somebody wants to, they can aspire to buy their own house on a normal wage.
We're a country,
lower modest income wage. So you have a system where you don't have to earn over 100 or 120,000 euros as a family to buy a house and spend an hour in your car every day going to and from work, working in a job you don't want. So the sort of social engineering part of it isn't my bag, but we all have kids, and this is what's facing our kids. Is this?
We mentioned this earlier on the way in. You're looking around and you're just going, children. You're looking at your kids and you're going, oh my God, I want them to have opportunities to be able to as you said, we call it social engineering, but actually it's really just aspirational of wanting them to be okay.
It'd be nice if somebody wanted to, they could spend time with their kids when they're growing up at a certain age, as opposed to having to work, put them in creches, get a second car, and sit in a car for an hour. And this is really a long term where we need to be looking at in terms of. And the interesting thing is housing affects all that, which is for me is sort of interesting, because I'd be more the technical and nuts and bolts end of it.
Yeah.
But the far-reaching consequences of this, increasing density doesn't work. What it does, increasing height increases site value. A unit price, the price of an apartment, if it's on the 6th floor or 8th floor, does not change because you get more units on it. What happens is
Lorcan said that this morning on Twitter. I don't know if you noticed. He said where someone said, someone argued from development standpoint that they could bring down the price, and he said, "Well, I just think I don't think that will be passed on to the purchaser."
I haven't seen that in 30 years.
Yeah.
And if anybody out there has one, please email it into Tony Groves. On this addressed envelope, tell me where any saving. By virtue, if something isn't valuable, if a saving is made, it goes on to the bottom line profit. It can't be passed on to the purchaser, or it's counterproductive. And the other thing that we mentioned were the sort of announcements. You know, at a certain point, I mean, I have two clients at the moment who have two sites, one who's getting an interest back in a site, and my advice to them is wait and see what concessions you're going to get. That's my objective advice to them, because you may get an extra floor, it'll increase your site value, you may get parking taken off, that'll increase your profit. So the more announcements or kite flying you make, the less momentum there is to actually build out anything.
Yeah.
So what you need to do is say, forget it, warts and all, let's keep it the way it is. That's it. That's what you get at the moment, because otherwise what you're doing is you're feeding into site speculation, and we know that that's rampant at the moment.
Yeah.
So the vacant site tax is very incredibly weak, will do nothing for it. And the other thing that we're seeing is people are exiting, taking their money off the table now, are folding their positions into REITs as well. That's started happening. So, you know, we've all of a sudden we've managed to come a long way very quickly from 06. We got the money. We lost it all. We all went wallop, and now we've a number of £400 gorillas in the room now, private equity. So we've really evolved very quickly, and you know, London has it, Vancouver has it, you know, New York has it.
I saw the statistic of seriously from you know the affordability rankings,
Sure, yeah.
and we've tipped over into the severely unaffordable. And people say, "Oh, that makes sense." It doesn't, because the other places are San Francisco. They are, you know, we are not San Francisco.
Yeah, I mean, you have a lovely view here. I mean, it's nice. It's a bit foggy today, but actually, it reminds me of the Golden Gate Bridge today, because you can't see the house next door to it. But you're right. I mean, our housing in Dublin started to become severely unaffordable in the end of 2011, and that's the same year that the affordable housing scheme was discontinued.
Yeah.
So currently the biggest hole that we have in policy at the moment is we've no definition of what an affordable house is, official definition. We've no affordable housing scheme. There's no intention of introducing one, and the legislation that underpinned the previous one has been set aside. So all government policy seems to be either deliberately or not increasing the value of housing, which is very good for an awful lot of sectors of the market, for bank balance sheets, people in negative equity, investors, homeowners, etc. Not so great if you're trying to buy a house. But the problem with that is if you don't balance that with measures to increase affordability, you're just the gap, the route is becoming further and further away, and the route to affordability. So you might live in a lovely house with your 3 kids at the moment. I live in Sandy Cove. It's very nice. I said to my kids, I can guarantee you will not be living here when you get older. You will be living someplace out for a long distance away, in a planet far, far away, and trying to. And that's the way it is. So we may be benefiting now.
Yes.
We don't ourselves, but our kids aren't, and our society won't. So we need to start looking at this a bit carefully.
I think that's
use the head.
I think that's a brilliant way to bring it to the end, because it's a simple fact. Mel, you've summed it up lovely. You've given us some great things to think about. Everybody's going to listen to this is actually going to have some real.
Well, there's something for everybody.
But
there's something for everybody in this. There's solutions, problems clearly identified, solutions to tackle the clearly identified problems. That's what people need on this now. Look, when you start getting phone calls tomorrow and they want to bring you in buildings as a special advisor, and they're going to bust the bank for you,
well, no,
just remember where you got your start.
I'm going to talk. I'm going to talk to you, but you know that job you said €350,000. What job? Where was that? Do you have an forwarding address for that? I know, but I mean the thing about it is, you also have to remember that a lot of these things appear they're not intractable at all. If we can organise ourselves and do something really badly, we can as easily turn around and do it very easy. It's just a case.
You actually spend less time organising better than you do.
Exactly, we can do it
badly.
The technical people are out there to sort this out, and there's also some really good people. I've met 1 or 2 really good officials in the housing agency and also in the department. So the people are there. You know, but look at this very simplistically as almost like a site. You know, when I go on a site, there's a few things you know if a site isn't being run properly. Now, the foreman might be really nice and nice guy. If he can't do his job, you have to get rid of him, because otherwise the site isn't going to work. And I think we have a situation at the moment where, you know, 1 or 2 senior officials in the department, they would need to be you know, they might be fine, and it's fine in a downturn when nothing is happening, but you just question, are they able for it at the moment? Are they up to it? And I'm not able to, I don't know the personalities involved or whatever, but you just have to look at it very carefully and say, okay, what's going on here? Who's been involved? Who can do it? Who can't? Shuffle them around.
Just make the right decisions.
Yeah, and just make the right decisions and get moving on it. And as you say, just it'll allow us to concentrate on stuff that's sort of, you know, like health and education and these other things that are sort of minor.
Well, housing should never really be a problem. It should be something you have tick boxed away, you know, that you've managed for years to come.
Unfortunately, housing is always the problem because it's cyclical. When I meet people I know in the business, they say, how are you? We say, grand, are you busy? Yeah. How long do you think it'll last? That's the first question they say. I swear to God, that's the first question. And you go, who knows? And I mean, one of the very first, a guy, Frank Hall, I worked with in 1992. He was an architect, a rare beast, an architect turned developer. And he started building in Clamrazel Street, ended up building about 48 units on a shoestring, and he did really well. But he described the market to me at that stage, and it was spot on. I've thought about this, I'd say, at least once a week ever since then. And he said it was like musical chairs. Nobody knows, if you're developing, nobody knows when the music is going to stop. But when it stops, and if you're not sitting down,
you're done.
You're finished.
Yeah.
And that happened to him in the 70s, but he came back and he got his timing right. But the problem is if we put all of our eggs in that basket as a society,
It'll happen again.
Everything is very cyclical, and we can see the way it's so we need a constant stream. A lot of people have called for it. The state should be just doing this drip, 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 certain amount, 3, 4 to 5,000 houses a year, as we've done over the years. Building these houses, we own 130,000. We've got about 9,000 as a percentage of social housing in Ireland. It should be around 18.
Yeah.
That's the international norm. So we should be doing this, and that will allow us to level the whole thing out, so we don't have these peaks and troughs. But unfortunately, because we've ignored all the other ways of building, we're the most volatile housing sector in Europe. When you look at the comparisons of Denmark, Sweden, France, Germany, all these other countries, we're outlier in all the metrics in terms of
in ups and downs,
Ups and downs,
which is when you see the statistic, we leap over everybody else, and then we plough below everybody else. Look, we're going to end optimistically. It's gone really well. I'm delighted that you came in. We've had a really this conversation is actually giving me a lot to talk about. As I said to Martin, I said, I bet you I get about 15 articles out of this. Look,
do I get copyright on any of that?
In
fairness, most of my ideas are robbed.
I was going to say, I don't. No one pays me anyway.
You're doing great stuff. I think it's great. I think a big part of this is letting people know what's going on. And you know, we all hear opinions everywhere, but if you tell people the facts and let your listeners come to their own conclusions,
yes,
it's all pretty self-evident, really, when you get down to
Our
it.
podcast listeners are grown-ups, you see, and we
there
treat
you go.
them like grown-ups.
You don't. Right. I just want to thank everybody for listening and remind you to subscribe to us on iTunes, SoundCloud, wherever you get your podcasts from. I keep finding these people are subscribing on these apps that I've never heard of, and they're going, this does it. So yeah, look, guys, all of our previous podcasts are available on echochamberpod.com. You can send us an email to echochamberspod@gmail.com, or you can follow us on Twitter at echochamberspod. Thanks again, folks. Thanks so much.